I think, you know, one of the things that total quality management did for us was to change our worldview, to show us that these two things that we thought were antithetical, you know, quality and cost, were in fact not antithetical at all, and there was a higher order way of looking at problems and a set of techniques and tools accompanying that that would let us kind of escape the prison of a set of trade-offs that were a function of our own tools and perspectives, not a function of the reality of the problems we were trying to solve. And I think design thinking does very much that, in that it helps us find ways to kind of this seeming trade-off between being creative and innovative and generating ideas. And traditionally in business, this skill we have about testing and beating the crap out of everything with numbers and Excel spreadsheets, and it says, you know what, there is a higher order reality that you can be both data-driven and innovative and successful in a traditional business sense at the same way. And again, as with total quality management, here are a set of tools and techniques and processes that we believe can be taught to at least achieve literacy, certainly not achieve excellence at the black belt level like designers have, but certainly can be taught to all managers. And so I think that part is, I see a lot of parallels. I also think the other parallel that we have to be prepared for is the complete bastardization of design thinking in the process of having it become the next total quality management. Because if you look at what actually happens to total quality management, often in its implementation in organizations, it loses a lot of the power that it ought to have, in part because, like design thinking, its value system fundamentally challenges many of the values that organizations hold dear. And so this idea that we can look to techniques and achieve the outcomes we want while ignoring the set of values that drive the success of those techniques, I think we've seen time and time again in total quality management, in all of the empowerment movements, in the learning organization movement. I mean, all of these movements in business, when the values clash, if you're not willing to address the values, chances are what you implement under the name of design thinking will not live up to our expectations for what it could be. Now, I have this naive hope that because of the intense human grounding of design thinking, which total quality management lacked in many ways, right? That there's kind of an emotional pull that design thinking has, that when you immerse managers in it, they kind of get caught up in how wonderful it is to actually develop deep insights about these people that you're trying to serve. And that, so the values are so inherently human, and because of that, they have such power that, I don't know, I have an optimism that we'll do a better job of that values conflict than we have in other areas. So, sorry for such a long answer.
But in a way, and maybe James comment on this as well, but in a way, TQM, it was all about collaboration. It was all about co-design. It was all about bringing interdisciplinary teams. It was all about having people who were very expert in that domain be able to spread and engage communities in it. But as you rightly say, it was all about, it was process-centric, not people-centric.
Yes, although it was an important way. I mean, as I understand, when I think of total quality management, and you go back to Deming, this notion that we're trying to drive fear out of the marketplace, yes, that we're empowering workers to stop the line, that the decision-making autonomy rests with them. Yes. So I do think there was a very human-centered aspect to TQM, but that part of it got lost and driven out in a lot of implementations.
Yeah, I'm going to offer a slightly more contentious view, maybe, and maybe possibly less evangelical view. I think it's interesting to reflect on why something like TQM and Lean gets traction in organizations. Why does it become the fashion or the fad or the big idea that companies want to take up? And you might argue, I could be wrong, you might argue that something like TQM gives managers some immediacy of results. So we can take out waste, we can reduce our costs, we can do something quickly and immediately that makes them look like they're doing some good work and being successful. You might also argue that it's inherently logical. You know, there's a logic and a system to the things that are being done, and that probably appeals to the managers who are implementing it. And in contrast, trying to sell an idea like design thinking, I don't think has the same immediacy. It might have, for some managers, the emotional appeal, but immediacy in terms of results, that they can turn around and say, we've cut our costs, we've taken out some percentage of the business or whatever it might be. It's a more emotional sell. And it's something being promoted to them as a good thing from lots of people, but there's something appealing about looking at a big company like Toyota and saying, they've done it, they're successful, we'll copy what they do. So I wonder if it's not quite such an easy sell as something like TQM or Lean. So that's a slightly less...
Might I suggest, though, that the kind of the agenda of the 80s and 90s that spawned TQM was one of operational efficiency, of kind of squeezing the waste out of organizations. Design thinking is the one about creating new levels of value inside the organization and for its customers and driving innovation as a tool for achieving that. So I think the kind of agenda of the 2000s makes it pertinent for this to be almost like the kind of religion that TQM became, design thinking becoming that. Now, we had a comment coming from the back. Yes, your hand was raised. So please introduce yourself. And I think, do we have another mic as well so we can record what's being posed?
Moving mic, it's behind you.
Okay. If not, you can come up. But if you have a point you'd like to make or a question, yes, please introduce yourself as well. And
just for the video, can you hear me?
yeah, it's not the hearing, it's making sure we're recording.
Roberto Verganti, Polytechnic in Milano. So I can take the position of Ezio Mazzini, I can imagine what you would say. I like the question about TQM because I've been using this metaphor several times to describe the possible trajectory of design thinking. And it's interesting that you all use the word it was. TQM was. And it was the past tense used several times. And that's actually is an interesting exercise to do because it will be the design thinking was if we put ourselves in 5 years. In the sense that the trajectory of TQM, it was very relevant, actually made a difference. But after a while, when every company was starting to use TQM, it didn't make a difference anymore. I mean, we teach this in strategy and business schools, so we know that things become a source of differentiation when not everyone is doing the same thing. So my question is, if we learn from TQM, the trajectory of TQM, will the same happen? And that's a big challenge because designers always say that design makes a difference. What happens when all designers, all companies do the same? Will design thinking will become the TQM of the future, which means everyone does it, but it doesn't make a difference anymore? Sorry to be a little provocative.
No.
I've been through a conference of design management for 3 days of this total auto celebration design is great, every company should. And I think that our role is not to be celebrity, it's to be critical.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Roberto. Now, Neil, do you want?
That's a great question.
Okay, you take that one there. Okay.
And I would say, if I was a designer, I might worry about that, but as a business person, I think the best thing that could happen was for us to stop talking about design thinking because it became such an embedded competence that you didn't talk about it anymore, you just did it. You didn't even talk about it as design thinking, you just talked about it as a core competence. I mean, Karin Hansen at Intuit has spoken, I think, quite eloquently on this. And she said she'll know she's succeeded when no one has to talk about design thinking, it'll just be business as usual. Yes. But it will be business as usual that incorporates this as a core practice of managers. Now, I think we'll still need designers to do what we would call the traditional and real design. But maybe we won't need designers anymore to tell us all how to think a little bit more creatively. I don't know.
Well, my own experience before I just pass this along is that, for me, TQM started off like the medicine we all took, and then it became part of our DNA. And I think if design thinking gets into the DNA of an organization, then we'll just be dealing with who's able to make it work best, who's got the best set of genes. And then that would be pretty strong. Neil?
Yeah, I'm not 100% au fait on the detail of TQM, but just from the tone of the conversation, it sounds to me like the clear distinction between that and design thinking and design practice is that TQM is more focused on the stuff that you do and doing that better, whereas design thinking, design practice is naturally outward looking and looking towards the future. So actually, I take your point, Roberta, about actually once everyone started doing TQM, then there's no distinction. But if everyone's doing design thinking and employing designers, actually the directions that you can go off into are myriad. And so I just wonder whether there's a possible distinction there. Coming back to Jean's point, though, about actually when design thinking is more embedded and we're sort of living and breathing it more and more, that's fantastic. I think there's, coming back to what I was trying to get across in my deck, is that I think there's still a need to draw the distinction between the craft and the profession of design and creating output, and bringing lots of client sponsors up to speed with what that can do for them. And design thinking is a really good bridge, the way I see it, it's a really good bridge to that particular gap.
Okay, I'm just going to comment and also ask Iliana to maybe come in on this one as well. You know, Ezio was talking very much about a kind of new role for designer. And the designer as, if not social worker, as a kind of social network convener of capability and facilitator. And I just wondered about the comments here, because we've got a kind of, perhaps even divergence in the panel. There's a kind of sense of the designer as the expert, versus the designer as the convener of processes and facilities and resources and tools that can enable an organization. So I just asked for views on that.
Well, I mean, you can see that especially service designers are taking more and more the role of facilitators. They call themselves, we are facilitators, we orchestrate the design process. So they involve different stakeholders and they empower the different stakeholders during the design process, keeping a facilitating role. So I definitely see the role of designers as more and more as facilitators, more than the expert, or more than those who come in and just, you know, present a big idea as if they were just magicians. They're not. So there is somehow there is a science, there is a rigorous methodology that happens behind the scenes. And I think that, you know, people working like business people can definitely learn this type of tools. Absolutely.
Neil, I mean, but do you think that facilitation should be done more by the design manager, then calling in the individual expertise in design, or is it the role of the designer per se to be able to do that?
I think it's the latter, and I think that the way that I see it is that you have I called them inadvertently legacy disciplines, so the kind of classic industrial, interior, fashion, etc., as kind of vertical columns, which have narrow field of vision but very deep understanding of that particular discipline. And I see service design and I see business design as lintel disciplines, that sort of macro disciplines that sit across the top, and I see design management as the stewardship of any of those processes. So service designers are quite naturally design managers, service designers are quite natural facilitators, service designers will know when they need to call on an industrial designer or a UX designer to develop an app. And they can facilitate completely kind of cross-functional teams. And I think common to all of those fields, designers are agnostic about what the outcome should be. So they won't predict, especially the guys who are working in the kind of macro disciplines, so service and business design. They'll embark on a brief, but they won't actually think about or predetermine where the answer lies. Whereas if you ask an industrial designer to tackle a problem, you'll get an industrial design outcome. So I think there's a distinction there.
Yeah, let me just pass this along to the other members of the panel here.
Again, I agree with the sentiment about the fact that, you know, there are designers who have expertise in designing in whatever their particular field or domain is, and we perhaps need to be cautious about assuming that all of those designers are also what we might think about as design thinkers. You know, I think some designers don't wish to be facilitators and don't wish to do these other things. They wish to be great designers. And you know, I think we sort of automatically assume that all designers bring all of these skills that we talk about in the design thinking world, and I'm not sure that's always true.
Do you think we're equipping with in education people for these new and evolving roles? I mean, you know, you span both the world of business schools, but you're also very engaged in, with design schools too.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think one of the dilemmas is the world doesn't quite know what to do with the people that you really try hard to equip for both roles. Yes. I think the world knows what to do with designers and the world knows what to do with MBAs. But in our experience, when you take MBAs and you give them some design literacy, they get very excited, some of them, and they want to do it. and then they can't find opportunities. And I know, talking to people like Nathan Shedroff, who's worked very hard in the master's degree at the California College of the Arts, I think he would talk about a similar problem, that you know, we have to fit into employment categories, and the employment categories unfortunately lag the leading edge of practice. And so there's a lot of, I think, frustrated people who want to straddle both worlds, young people, who've tried to do that by often crafting their own kinds of education, because we don't make it easy in an MBA program, and I would suspect most people don't make it easy in a design program. But then they get out there, and it's very difficult for them to fit the pigeonhole. One of the complications that we found is that innovation itself is a battleground in most large organizations. I mean, it is the ultimate turf warfare locale. You've got basic R&D fighting with applied R&D, fighting with marketing, fighting with the product managers. There's about 5 different fiefdoms already trying to stake out that area called innovation. And then you have a young person coming out of college showing up and saying, well, gee, I'd really like to do this. How about giving me a job? And it's just a mess to even find out who you'd call and have a chance at getting a job. So I think the employment side of things, which we pay a lot of attention to in business school, because that's why people come to business school, it is a wicked problem in and of itself, how to actually get students jobs in this. And what we do now is we say, look, take the product manager's job, hang in there for a few years, and look for opportunities to move within into the innovation space, because A, you're not going to get a job in IDEO. I mean, I spend most of my life telling students who used to want to get a job with McKinsey, who now want to get a job with IDEO, that they have even less of a chance getting a job with IDEO than they had of getting one with McKinsey. And so they have to broaden their opportunities, and that there are actually other people doing this. But it's frustrating and it's hard when you're trying to get young people excited about the possibilities, and then you're throwing them into an environment that just doesn't yet have a clear place for them.
Okay. Can I just kind of move the discussion also to emerging spaces for innovation, which is around the kind of the social innovation agenda, which is where, you know, a lot of Ezio's considerations were. Also, if I just look at my own students who have just graduated, the average age is 31, so they're not kids. And almost all of their final year projects were all in the social innovation space. Do we see design management effectively addressing that, particularly in the public sector, do we think? You know, because the public sector is becoming an increasing commissioner of that. So I'm just going to ask the panel. I see a few nodding heads in the audience, and then throw that one open as we get the audience. Neil, do you want to begin? Because you've been quite involved in some public sector innovation, and Iliana, you might like to comment on this one.
Yeah.
We'll move it around.
I think the answer is yes, and increasingly so. I think we see some fantastic steps forward in terms of the appointment to the Cabinet Office of the Service Design Head of Policy Service Design. Apologies for getting the title not quite right. I think we see more and more people in the public realm wanting to learn more about service design, which is an amazing kind of green shoot that will no doubt lead on to actual work. It's still a relatively new area. You know, if design is not that well understood, and service design is a subset of that, then actually using service design and design thinking to crack some of these public space problems is that's emerging. But I think that, by contrast, there are some fantastic examples and case studies that are out there from some of the established London service design firms where they've worked in the public space. I'm working with a public body at the moment, helping them understand what service design can do for them in a kind of part training, part hands-on exercise, and that's going fantastically well, and they're sort of being illuminated accordingly. I did a piece of work with some GP practices as well on innovating in primary care, and I think that a lot of the stuff that designers do very naturally is just lifting the lid on the way that the world is for the citizen or for the user of that service, from the outside in, if you will. And the number of eyebrows that got raised through simple kind of journey mapping exercises where some of the GPs in this practice were saying, wow, does that really happen like that? Because, of course, they're so busy in their day jobs that they rarely get the opportunity to kind of get their head above water and see their service for the way that it really is for their users. So I think that's that's probably one of the biggest barriers. I think the receptors are on, but one of the biggest barriers in that arena is people actually having the time and space to commission and think in this new way, let alone deliver. But I think the receptors are there.
Can you just comment on this? Again, I'll pass our long wire across.
Well, I would agree completely. I think that in many ways that design thinking has even greater potential, I think, in the social sector. Why? Because organizations have known for a long time that you had to pay attention to your customers and what they wanted in order to be successful. And even though we didn't do it very well, and we've been stumbling around for decades trying to really sort through how we would actually do that, we have always known we were supposed to be doing it. And it seems to me the public sector in many areas has still lived with this notion that we are the experts, and therefore we will tell those of you who are poor, who are sick, who are whatever, exactly how to do this, and that it has legitimized this notion that we didn't really have to pay too much attention to the reality of their lives and what they actually thought they should be doing. And I think that's why design thinking with its methodologies like journey mapping really has the ability to contribute enormously. Now, I would say that on the implementation side, the impediments of bureaucracy and organizational inertia are oftentimes so much worse in the social sector. You know, unless we're looking at NGOs or kind of private social entrepreneurship, when you get into the government sector or the university, let's just talk close to home, it can be just, it's like swimming in molasses, right? I mean, to try and actually get anything through the bureaucracy. And so I think this notion of how we innovate within the confines of essentially bureaucratic organizations that are more interested in the continuation of their own comfort than they are of actually serving the needs of others, as much as we would never admit that, right? That's what the tenured system is for faculty. I think we'll really need to use a lot of design thinking to get creative in how we move these ideas through and pay attention to the tremendous challenges that we all face as we try and get movement. You know, the beauty of the almighty profit motive of business, I often joke when I go to our healthcare center at the university to work with the administrators there, and I come back to the business school, I kind of kiss the steps for the profit motive and say, thank you, God. Because the one thing the profit motive does is it gives you a yardstick against which you succeed or fail, and if you fail long enough, you will go away. I mean, unless maybe you're General Motors, in which case it's seemingly inexhaustible. But most organizations will go away over time if they consistently fail to make money, which is predicated on creating value for someone. Unfortunately, a lot of institutions in the social sector will not fail. They'll just keep going. And so without the clarity of that measurement, I think, in the absence of outstanding leadership, I think that's where leadership matters. Because in the absence of kind of clear live or die metrics like profitability, only courageous and highly skillful leaders will be able, I think, to embed these new ways of dealing with the world.
I feel like I've adopted the role of panel cynic with my cynic hat on. And I'll preface that by saying it's not that I don't actually believe that where we apply these good human-centered design approaches to all sorts of social systems, they can be better. Of course they can, whether it's in developing countries, whether it's in healthcare or anything else. But maybe a couple of thoughts. There's something interesting about a lot of public services now. They've had the pip squeezed out of them for all sorts of other reasons of cost and delivery, that yes, we now see them as being poor from a human perspective, but maybe if we went back 20 or 30 years ago, we'd have said they actually did have a much more human face to them, and they certainly weren't the result of designers doing that. It's just that there's something that's happened in the meantime. So you know, we're now looking to redress those problems, but actually we did have a lot of services that were strong at some point, or human focus at some point. And for a long time, all sorts of businesses have introduced new services. And so when banks first introduced ATMs, they introduced a new experience for customers. They allowed us to have a different relationship with the banks, so when they open on Saturdays. And they are inherently looking to do things that are new services and good for us. So is there anything really different? And are we trying to give the stuff that businesses do a new name just for the sake of it when they're actually already and have been doing it for a long time? So that's my slightly cynical hat.
Now I'm going to throw it out. We had a question right at the back, and then we had your question too. So,
yes. Hi, my name is Jack Martin from the National. You're actually working right in the eye of a hurricane when you were talking about how do you actually measure public institutions and whether they deliver. And what we've been trying to do is to develop impact as an alternative to profits. To actually see when you as a public institution pay for a service or you implement a new service, can you actually measure the impact and can you use that to give some kind of guidance whether or not you're performing as you should? And what was quite surprising to us was that there seemed to be no systematic science or work being done in actually create these kind of impact measures. So you can say the public sector really don't have these kind of things they can navigate around. They don't have anything where they can kind of compare, look, are we actually doing our job well? And we kind of saw if we can actually create those kind of impact measures, we might actually give the public sector the tool to either navigate, to steer, or to force them to steer, because you can suddenly benchmark them, you can compare them. But I was quite surprised that, when we look at Europe, where between 40 and 50% of GDP is spent by the public sector, that actually we have no way of measuring whether what they do is well or not well. And, if we can kind of get that dimension into service design or service management for the public sector, we might actually have something that we could compare to the profit motive of, they will probably not go away, as you say, but we might actually have something that we can use to navigate.
Jakob, just also to describe how Living Lab works with different cities, so it also puts into context your comments. You work with a lot of different cities and a lot of different service providers as well to those cities.
Yeah, so basically what we do is that we actually have an ongoing dialogue with a number of cities around the world in identifying what are their main challenges, their big problems in congestion, pollution, healthcare. And then we try and match them up with innovative solutions from around the world. So we actually try and replicate what works elsewhere, try and replicate that to a local context. And it's very difficult to get that type of import of innovation going for many of the reasons that you mentioned.
And I think part of the problem is we like to measure what's easy to measure. And that's true in business, it's true in government. And what's easy to measure is the data that's easily collected or already collected. And we're talking about becoming hypothesis-driven in our measurement systems. And I think the dilemma is, in business, as data-intensive as we are, I mean, we love data in business, right? So you would think that that would imply that we are hypothesis-driven. We're not. We take the data we've got, and we try really hard to use it to answer the questions. We don't start with a set of questions and assumptions and then think about what data we need to test it well and go get it. I mean, I always argue that we did that as strategy consultants. That is why businesses hire McKinsey and the Boston Consulting Group. It's because in order to justify an investment in a future that does not yet exist, you have to make up data. Because the data, you can't verify with existing data. You can't test with existing data a situation that does not yet exist. So you go out and you get the kinds of data that will let you make creative leaps to justify a series of behaviors. Well, it turns out that in business organizations, after you've paid McKinsey several $100,000 to make that leap for you, people go along with you. No one lets their own managers make up numbers. I mean, it's just not done. So a manager goes in and says, this is a future I see. This is why I believe it. And the finance people look at it and they say, are you crazy? Where did you get that assumption? I mean, where's that data? I don't believe that data. And of course, you can never convince them. So we put innovators who have to prove their ideas in a completely impossible situation because we're not willing to experiment and we're not willing to be hypothesis-driven in our approach. And so I think that's part of it, teaching people how to follow the #1 rule of design, I think, which is to be hypothesis-driven in your thinking, to gather data that allows you to formulate a good hypothesis, to surface the assumptions about why you believe that to be true, then to conduct experiments in the real world on a small and rapid scale to see if, in fact, those assumptions are true. And I think that's the problem-solving methodology that sounds so obvious to us, but is mostly counterintuitive to most normal people, I think.
Your question
yes.
here, or observation.
Thank you. I'm Francesco Cara. I work at Sapient here in London, and I'm a strategist, so I drive digital transformation that then we develop with our technical capabilities. I'd like to go back a second to the social innovation aspect. What we have been seeing in London over the past 2 years is a wonderful organization being set up, which is called GDS, the Government Digital Services. And by magic, Government Digital Services has been attracting the best talent in London in the design space, or some of the best talent. And to me, it reveals something. We have a clash of values, I really believe, and I think that digital management should really have a clear point of view on this topic. We have, on the one hand, designers, and designers have a view of innovation as social progress. So it's not innovation per se, it's innovation to make the world a better place. And then we have management people who have a very different set of values and very, very different drivers. It's much more performance, it's much more effectiveness, efficiency in running a business and making it as profitable as possible. And these two things don't really go very well together fundamentally. So, you know, it's really water and oil. And my question is whether you in DESMA, with your project, you are experimenting differences in brands and organizations in the way they relate to digital management. My very naive hypothesis is that you are not working with Ryanair, for instance, but you're working with Philips or with Volvo, very progressive organizations, truly very, very progressive organizations. And my view, my understanding through my practice is that there are some organizations for which design management resonates. Other organizations that are not interested in design management, because I think that only some organizations can really make sense of the integration of values of business performance with values of social progress.
Can I actually say something? I agree with you, and I think that design management actually works in those organizations where the commitment to design starts from the top. So when leaders, like organizational leaders, they can actually understand what design can bring to the table and what designers can bring to the table. So what I usually do when I teach design management, especially to MBA students, I spend a lot of time telling my students how important design can be in order to create value, and how a systematic commitment to design and to employ designers can actually bring value. Because if we still think that, you know, using design and leveraging upon design means hiring a bunch of superstar designers in order to revamp a product line, that's wrong. That's a very short-term type of, you know, approach and strategy. So, I mean, if I think of the most successful design-based companies, design-driven companies, those are companies where the leaders are very committed to design, where there is a function of design or design management, where we have a VP of design management, for example.
Can I add just one point? Is commitment sufficient, or do you need to be in a company that is truly committed to forms of social progress behind the exercises everyone does around corporate social responsibility? Isn't it something related to the brand, to the real key purpose and values of some enterprises that play as a key factor in the uptake and the adoption of design management?
I totally agree with you. So the commitment starts from the top, but then it needs to be somehow translated into the entire organization. Yes, absolutely. So it's not just the designer's job. Design is not just the designer's job inside the organization, but it's everybody's job. So the commitment has to happen, you know, across the board inside the organization. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I'm going to pass to Neil here, because I mean, you know, you think of Michael O'Leary and the alignment of the values of the designer. I want social progress, and Michael O'Leary at Ryanair may have a much more focused set of ways of thinking about value creation. And clearly, you described it as oil and water. In Italy, you take olive oil and balsamic vinegar, you mix them together and create something very special. So maybe that's what design managers do.
I hear what you're saying, and I agree. I think there's so much to do with the landscape within which that organisation sits. So and to an extent, what is the kind of compelling need to use design, and therefore how embedded that gets. So I also think there's a piece here about, I've just noted down here, layers and leaders, that there's a piece for me about kind of top down. We need at least one leader around the board table just to leave the door ajar to allow some of the members of his or her team to practice some of these things. So often the leadership of organisations are not open to that, and that means that actually, try as they might, design teams just don't their output doesn't go anywhere. And we need to take people on the journey of the design processes themselves. So whilst we have leadership at the top of organisations leaving the door ajar to allow the head of design to go and recruit the best talent, we also need to allow that talent to grow and take other members of the organisation on the journey with them. I think that's a critical thing. And I'm really glad I didn't grab the microphone quick enough, but I was also going to mention about GDS, Government Digital Service. For anyone who doesn't know, in the UK now, if you hit gov.uk, there's a massive piece of work going on about how you access information to do with government in the public space. And Ben Terrett and his team are doing an amazing job of cutting through swathes of complexity and presenting that in a very user-centered way. The example that he would give, because I've heard him say it a couple of times, if you go to the VAT page, the one piece of information that they found out that most people want to look at when they go to the VAT page is what's the current rate of VAT. So in a big box on the VAT page is the current rate of VAT is 20%. And there's a whole load of little links underneath that take you off into more detailed information. That's really design at its best, if you ask me. That's kind of getting under the skin of what users want and going and delivering that. And that's this kind of outside-in approach that that happens when one's using design processes.
I think Ryanair is a very interesting example to talk about. Now, I have no idea of the detail in Ryanair. Maybe it would be a good case study to do. Because I think we have to be careful about assuming that actually to be effective at design management you need social progress and all these other things. You know, maybe what they do is very sophisticated and very clever, and they are using design very carefully and consciously to create something we might not like, but actually is appropriate for them as a business. And you know, it's the appropriateness that matters rather than them doing what we might view as the perfect thing. And what might be appropriate for them may certainly be different for Rolls-Royce, and certainly be different for a public service. So I think we should be a bit careful about saying that all businesses have to do this same thing rather than what's appropriate for them in the context they're sitting in.
That would be a very interesting question you might want to reflect on as well. Should designers be values agnostic and just focus on value?
I would say that
it's a very interesting,
I would say that many designers are values agnostic. And actually the very fact that so much rubbish stuff is produced around the world, and we consume so much stuff. So many businesses producing things we've got to throw away the next year, whether they're technology firms, suggests that some of the firms we idolise as the best are clearly values agnostic.
Is it time we had a kind of Hippocratic oath for designers and design managers? Well, that's another one. Now, we've had a comment from the back here, and I'm going to put all the questions over to you now for the panel. So please introduce yourself.
My name is John Luca. I'm the director. I'm not literate as you are, so I probably failed all your exams. In the academic parts, I'm a bit more skilled in the practice. Has a paper ever been done differentiating management and design in companies that are founded by inventors or founded by makers versus companies that are run by managers? So founded and run by inventors versus run by managers, because there's going to be a huge difference, I suspect, in design management.
I'm going to throw that over to all the academics here as well as our panel. Observations.
If you go to the world of entrepreneurship, it's a very interesting discussion, I think, to what extent are entrepreneurs by nature design thinkers, right? And what is the overlap there? And I think when you look at entrepreneurs, they are experimenters like design thinkers. They are improvisers. They are synthesizers. They are, however, usually not particularly data-driven in terms of identifying unmet needs. They tend to have an idea and they design a company around their idea. And if it happens to meet a lot of unmet needs, then they become wealthy. And if it doesn't, then they go bankrupt, right? So I think entrepreneurs have certain attributes that we would share with design thinkers. But what we know with entrepreneurs is many of them turn out to be just kind of terrible at actually building a business. In almost every entrepreneurial business, there's a crisis point at which the entrepreneur lets go and turns it over to professional managers, right? And it's the rare one that stays with it. So I think one of the problems is that there is a fundamental tension between building organizations to be innovative versus building organizations to produce stable, reliable products. Large organizations are designed themselves for predictability and control. Right? I mean, you can't be P&G and run a business with hundreds of thousands of people distributing products around the world and rely on rapid experimentation as your major method for getting anything done, right? And this stability and control, which we design organizations for, then creates these terrible barriers that for innovators that I don't think ever go away. So I think no matter who founds an organization and what the values are, when it gets to a certain size, innovation becomes essentially a subversive activity. And for me, the best part of design thinking is it is so effective as a subversive activity. It lets managers.
You're a great teenager.
It lets managers innovate in spite of the organizations they work for, not because of them. And if we wait until leaders shape organizations that will support innovation, we will wait a very long time and all be dead, in my view. So part of the excitement of being an educator is to figure out how to educate people to succeed at being innovative in spite of the fact that, by and large, no matter how enlightened the organization they work for is, it's a bureaucracy, and it essentially wants to control. It doesn't want to open up for people the freedom to explore. I mean, variation is the mother of waste, as TQM tells us, so an organization's goal is to stamp out variation. Variation is also the mother of invention. And so, you know, I think when we look at entrepreneurs, it would be nice if all we needed was a set of more enlightened leaders to go out into large organizations, which would then become innovation friendly. Maybe I'm too much of a cynic when it comes to organizations, but I don't see it.
I agree wholeheartedly. Fundamentally, for organizations to do steady business, they need to be stable and have control, and therefore doing new things is always going to challenge that.
So if necessity is the mother of invention, it seems that desperation is the father of innovation in this one.
Exactly.
Only then.
Like
It's a marvelous catch-22. If you do too much disruptive stuff, you destroy the control and stability. If you don't do it, you don't have a future.
Google is one of the least user-centered. I mean, if you go out to Silicon Valley to a DMI conference and listen to designers who work for tech firms like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and all those, they will tell you they are the least user-centered places you have ever seen. They're run by engineers, and they live and die by technology breakthroughs. Right? And they can, because they're in the life cycle of a firm where it's the next technology breakthrough that creates value. It's not getting better at listening to your users and building value through that. So I think in part it is very hard to standardize from the high-tech startups to the rest of the organizations in the world, because I think they live and die from a competitive advantage viewpoint by not missing a technology leap, which is very different than how most other organizations, I think, live. So I don't think they're any more user-driven than General Motors. They just operate in an environment where the key survival capability set you need today is not to be user-driven. It's to make the next leap in technology.
Neil, you work with a few technology firms as well. Your observations on that one?
Well, I was going to come back on the point about the kind of large organisation stability, actually, because I think that's a really fantastic observation. And one of the ways that I've sort of worked when I've been on the inside of some of these big organisations and helping clients who are big organisations is that I love the rise of the term intrapreneur. And it seems to me that on the inside of the organisations, one should celebrate the little pockets of entrepreneurs themselves and give them, sort of fan the flames of their capabilities and give them permission to play with design teams. The other way to do that, of course, is to break down and kind of convene an internal team from their regular day jobs and almost stick them in a speedboat to go off and do the project work, by contrast to the oil tanker that may be the big organisation, and kind of get them to go off, go and explore the new territory and radio back to the tanker and say, hey, this is what we've discovered. You need to do a course correction 3 degrees to port. And by the way, we've gone and built some of this stuff. That's the way that we did flatbeds. We went from the first sketch to the first prototype airplane in 14 months. Which was pretty much unheard of in the industry. That was a breakthrough, you know, the world's first flatbeds in business class, massive technical, commercial, design, industrial design challenges. And we did that because I was heading up a small team of 5 to 6 people who were seconded from the day job. So I think there's a thing there. And then the important design management query becomes the interface from that little pocket to the rest of the organisation, which is my reference from sort of even internal design teams have to sort of interface back in. And I think it would be very interesting, as the gentleman suggested, to look at entrepreneur and innovator-owned companies by contrast to some of the bigger companies, so get a good spread as the research.
I wasn't praising the value of an entrepreneur per se. I was saying that companies that are successful, so that have survived, and are led by the inventor, that is a technical master who's realized that what he likes is what people like him will like. How is the design process managed in that company versus a company that doesn't have the founder inventor anymore on the board? Okay.
I think it would be a brilliant thing to research, and my hunch would be that design would feel a much more natural kind of discipline. Designers would feel much more at home in the kind of inventor-owned organisation as opposed to the larger corporate that sort of almost has to do design by necessity.
Well, you've just described Apple before Steve Jobs died. But anyone who's Apple will know they were not user-driven at all, right? Apple is the original genius design model. It's Moses parting the Red Sea.
Well,
it's not design thinking.
We come from an area, I work for Casino, so we have all these little companies that are run by owners. Okay?
Yes.
So, where you see all this. And so, is there a global study that can be done on this field?
I think it's certainly, this is a research organisation, DESMA. By definition, we've got a dozen PhDs. And if any of you PhD guys aren't thinking about banging on the door of Casino right now, going and doing a case study, then you're missing out. Because I think the doors are open for a brilliant case study. And as you've seen, to be published, you only need 1 or 2 deep case studies. James shows that. Yes, Roberto, again, please. We have time for a couple more observations and questions.
Just to leverage what you were saying, I think this, and what you are saying, I think this is a big area of investigation that we should address. I always say this example. I was in Harvard when there was a 100-year celebration of Harvard, a few years ago. And I was having lunch next to another professor, and I said, what are you doing research on? And I'm investigating design, innovation, Apple. And then I said, Apple is Steve. Told me, yes, Apple is Steve Jobs. That's the genius, So I mean, it's not relevant. So it turned out after a few years that actually example of companies like Apple or Alessi or Casino, company led by entrepreneurial geniuses,
yes,
are successful.
Yes.
So why we are still considering those companies as exceptions? There are exceptions, and then there is the real business. So in our business school, we keep teaching another model. Consider those as, by chance it happened, but you cannot replicate. I think there is a big space to understand why instead those companies, Alberto Alessi didn't take any MBA, yes. Steve Jobs didn't take any MBA, but there is a way of being that is different that we need to unlock.
Is the question, is the MBA getting in the way? You don't have to answer it.
Yeah, related to that in terms of, I think, some of the things we're farming and researching, I mean, this old idea, why are we not also thinking about how designers, I mean, I think we see a lot of connections with entrepreneurship. How are we not training ourselves to be better entrepreneurs, to build the values and the things that we think are valuable, instead of continually trying to insert design in these processes that are about maybe the process, you know. I think that's the direction a lot of us see potential in this new the entrepreneurial space.
Okay. Other comments? I think we've got time for one more. Yes, yes, please.
Here from Dubai, from FSA Line, work with a customer experience group. One of the observations I constantly keep having is the fight for space, or the fight for spotlights, whether it's terminology called innovation or sustainability or whatever else. Trouble with all of them is really around trying to carve out that niche or that space. And that's where you go into all sorts of conflicts. But what's really helped us is to try and play to every other interest area out there. So it's not about the leadership wanting to do it, because that permission is never ever coming. So how do you just create enough movements around so that people can start to think, or at least not seek permissions, really? What's really helped is for us to be thinking, how do we become those Intel insights, whether it is the organizational front, whether it's the social space, whether it's entrepreneurs or wherever else. So how do you play that little thing and become a chip for everything else? So how do you power everything else without actually being labeled as that?
I think that's a wonderful description. Design thinking isn't an end, it's a means to an end. And I think the more we just try and proselytize in organizations that design thinking is good and therefore you should do design thinking, no one's really interested other than designers in that logic, from what I can tell. Everyone else is trying to get some stuff done, and in what I've seen, the most successful organizations at diffusing design thinking have been ones where they offer design thinking in service to what everybody else was trying to do. So they were there with this notion, not I'm here to bring you design thinking, I'm here to help you solve your problem. So let's explore this problem together and let's figure out how to get it solved. And I think to be successful in a business organization, that's the attitude you have to take, because really, who but people who love design thinking really care about design thinking? Its only utility is to let us do things that we're not able to do without it. And so to lead with it versus leading with the problem that someone else is trying to have it solve, I think is critical. But that's hard if your whole identity is packed into design, I think. Right? Those of us who are kind of, management whores who just show up and help managers do whatever they want with whatever technique works. I think you build your identity as problem solvers, and design thinking is just another thing in your arsenal to help you solve problems. I have found it harder for designers to go there, because the notion is we are valuable in and of ourselves for who we are and this unique set of skills we have. And if you don't recognize that, then that's your problem, not ours. But that's not really a route to success in a business organization, I think.
Well, it's a very, very interesting way to end this session right now, because we've just thrown something right down on the table that I think we're going to discuss at length over lunch, if that's okay. Now, I'd like you to thank all of our panel. Our keynotes today have been brilliant. Ileana, who organized all of this as well. And
actually, I would like to thank Oriana and Anna and Eva, who did an amazing job in organizing this. I only did a very little part.
You just invited me.
Oh, okay. That was the most important part.
But please join me in thanking our panel.